My name is John R., and I've been in recovery since April 1st, 1981, April Fool's Day. This video includes the part of the video from the Emotional Sobriety webinar in which I tell a little bit of my story, and then in this video I extend that in order to include the slide presentation on spiritual bypassing, which I didn't have time to present at the webinar. I hope it is helpful to you. I'd like to tell you a little bit of my story as it relates to spiritual bypassing, which is my topic. But first, I want to say from the outset that I don't mean to imply that the paths I took were responsible for the way I took them, or that those spiritual processes are inherently paths that lead to spiritual bypassing. In addition, this is just a thumbnail sketch that covers a small bit of a journey I took for many years, and that journey continues today. So I remember as a kid wandering around by myself in the fields of Thousand Oaks, California, and enjoying being alone, being in nature and the quiet of the walks. And of course, Thousand Oaks in the 50s was very different than it is now. You could wander around for hours without being disturbed by traffic or houses or people. My earliest memories were of feeling that I wasn't really part of any of the groups of kids I knew or of the adults in my life, or even of my own family. I was the fifth of six children and much younger than my older siblings. From my earliest moments, I always felt there was something wrong with me, that I wasn't enough, that I didn't measure up or belong, or, um, you know, I only felt okay when I was alone, really. Even when I was sick as a kid, my MO was to be by myself. I still am pretty much that way. My dad had been a pretty well-known news broadcaster with CBS, and my mother had an office supply bookstore after my dad bought the local paper to change his careers. So I had very little interaction with them from a pretty early age. My older siblings were all pretty busy being teenagers to bother with me. And like probably everybody, I learned most of my really great life techniques. Some people call them character defects, others defense mechanisms. But I learned them in my formative years. I learned that to be heard or seen, I needed to get very angry or use my intelligence and language to win the day. And I was also a victim of sexual, emotional, mental, and physical abuse. So I can trace a lot of my underlying conflicts and patterns of perception, as well as my reactions to life and living, back to both a lack of attachment to a caregiver and also to the trauma of abuse in my earliest years. The pain that underlay these experiences was a significant factor in my learning to use spiritual methods to avoid that pain, the pain that kept bubbling up beneath the surface of my consciousness. Of course, I wasn't aware of that for many years. My family wasn't particularly religious. I remember seeking out various churches to find an answer to life's meaning and how to escape the disconnectedness. I felt that to overcome the problem, I needed to overcome the problem of me, of being me. So that by the time I was about 11, I started acting on stage in a community theater. And not coincidentally, that's when I started drinking. Acting brought me a lot of relief. Um, you know, Actually, what I know now is that acting may have saved my life for a time. What I really wanted was to just disappear. I wanted to get rid of the me that wasn't enough and was such a mistake. And in acting, I found emptying out myself and inhabiting a character gave me a lot of relief, both emotionally and mentally. I mean, it was okay to express pain and emotion as a character, but after the play was over, I needed to book out the back door of the theater. So by the time I went to college, I had found psychedelics in addition to alcohol and other drugs. Psychedelics, yay! What a great way to escape into the void and disappear from being me. Except I kept coming back to everyday earth time. So I sought out methods to stay there. I did Raja Yoga, meditation, etc., etc., etc. And my second year of college, I was approached by a group of radical, fanatical Jesus freaks who said, drop out, follow Jesus. They lived communally all over the world and seemed to have a real connection emotionally and mentally with each other. And that was real attractive. So I dropped out of college, and for about 8 or 9 years, I became an evangelical fundamentalist disciple of Jesus. I thought that the ministry would save me from the self that was, according to their theology and my inner narrative, intrinsically sinful and worthless. I memorized verses from the Bible, I preached the word, led different communes in the United States. Through it all, I never quite felt real or authentic or anything else sufficiently to overcome my sinful nature. Now, part of the problem I've learned was that I was trying to die to self and leave the past behind. The problem was that I never actually dealt with the past to leave it behind. So instead, I became more and more dependent on booze to get me by, which took me out of that ministry, and my subsequent abuse got worse and worse after that. I had a wife and 4 children by then, and life became impossible for her too. I abandoned the family to continue my downward spiral into my hoped for oblivion and death. But by 1981, faced with the fact that I wasn't going to get to die, I made the rash decision to go to a 12-step meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous and check out their theology. Fortunately, they didn't really have much, and I managed to get sober for the first time in many, many years. But even when I got to the program and stayed sober and worked the steps, there was still that sense that the idea was to rise above and climb the mountains of spirituality. Barely beneath the surface of my consciousness, there was this sense that if I did it all correctly, including all the spiritual processes I tried, then I would become a truly spiritual man and rise above all conflict and walk placidly amid the noise and haste with long flowing robes and be one with the spiritual being I thought I was supposed to be and be untouched by anything like a real human emotion. Then I would be loved and lovable. Well, I spent several years in more than one 12-step program, CODA, Al-Anon, SLAA, ACOA, among them. And I really did my best to work the program in each of them. All of them helped a lot in terms of my behavior and my ability to cope with life, my inner work, but I couldn't shake that sense that there was just something deeply wrong with me. It was my ego or my soul. Or here's some of the spiritual things I tried during my years in the program. I came in a Christian, but had trouble with some of the beliefs in the rooms that didn't agree with my theology. Things like the 24-hour-a-day book, which used to really tick me off. My sponsor said, stop reading it. I tried a very painful brand of sexuality, which is beyond the scope of this talk, in an effort to go beyond myself. I got into various types of meditation, like Shakti Gawain's creative visualization in the 80s, New Age things like the I Ching, the Book of Runes, etc. I began seriously studying Buddhism around my 7th year of sobriety in an effort to overcome the self, to enter into the stream of enlightenment and fix myself or non-self, as the case may be. Essentially, I was using the same approach to Buddhism and meditative techniques as I had with Christianity and with the other 12-step programs. And I was also adopted later on into a Lakota family by a very famous medicine man and began learning ceremonial ways of the Red Road. But in each case, the underlying axiom was the same delusion I hadn't yet uncovered. I'm not enough. I'm a defective character. I have to find a way to eradicate that self and become okay. If I only worked hard enough, prayed long enough, did the right ceremonies the right way, I would become what I was not, whole and complete and free of pain. Here are some of the key phrases and ideas that reinforce the delusion I needed to annihilate myself to become okay. My inner understanding and approach as a Christian had emphasized this tendency toward annihilation of self with things like, but we are all as an unclean thing, and all our righteousnesses are as filthy rags. And that's from Isaiah. For I know that in me, that is in my flesh, nothing good dwells, from Romans. In 12-step programs, phrases like the ego must be smashed, which isn't in the big book, by the way, and my best thinking got me here were very attractive to my desire to disappear. These attacks on the self aren't part of my inner dialogue anymore since I consider them self-abuse, but I still hear people using them all the time. And in Buddhism, I thought emptiness and no self equated to the same disappearing act that would save me from the pain. If desires cause suffering, then detaching and not feeling or having desires should make me safe, right? I have since learned better about Buddhist precepts, but it was a painful road to let go of the underlying delusions. By the time I was 11 years into my sobriety, all of those efforts to rise above my own humanness and gain freedom from myself landed me in the desert outside of Tucson, Arizona, in a treatment center with a dozen or so other double-digit sober people. You know, they did a whole battery of tests, and the psychiatrist asked me afterwards, "How long have you been depressed?" I said, "Is that what this is?" I didn't know I was depressed. Well, partially it was that. You know how people always say, "Stop and smell the roses"? Well, I couldn't smell them. But actually, the treatment I received there was a first step in my journey out of that delusion of self-annihilation. And one of the first fruits was being able to smell the flowers at the treatment center. In other words, all my efforts to rise above my own humanness, to disappear and gain freedom for myself, were really an effort to avoid the pain of uncovering trauma in my history. This despite working all the steps on it as much as I could. The fact is, this psychological suicide delusion was ultimately placing a great dependence on the various paths like God, meditation, the 12 steps, myself, spirituality, to solve a problem that wasn't even the problem. It wasn't the real problem. As one of my early sponsors said to my suicidal thoughts, "You'd be killing the wrong person." So what is spiritual bypassing, and why couldn't I see it after all the step work and the therapy and all of that stuff? Spiritual bypassing, well, what is it? Basically, in me, it was a deeply held defense mechanism and an avoidance technique run amok. So, is it about salvation or enlightenment or what? Uh, hmm. In his classic book, Toward a Psychology of Awakening, the author John Welwood defines spiritual bypassing as using spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep personal, emotional, unfinished business, to shore up a shaky sense of self, or to belittle basic needs, feelings, and developmental tasks. And I basically did all of those, uh, especially the belittling of my basic needs and feelings, and using those spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep the personal unfinished business, though I tried. So, what are the signs of spiritual bypassing? I didn't have all of these symptoms, but they are just the most typical indicators of whether someone might be doing some spiritual bypassing. Not focusing on the here and now, living in a spiritual realm much of the time, define that as you like. Um, I really tried to live in the here and now a lot, but a lot of that was about living in a spiritual realm. Overemphasizing the positive and avoiding and or denying the negative, like demands to be happy, joyous, and free all the time, or always being positive, the power of positive thinking and denying that negative part. Being self-righteous about enlightenment, salvation, sobriety, It's really easy, especially as you get sober longer and longer and longer, to get a little self-righteous about sobriety, being overly detached and or anti-dependent. I was very anti-dependent. It's taken me a long time to learn how to be uh, less anti-dependent. Dependence on spiritual ideas and beliefs to avoid unwanted emotions. Having feelings of entitlement, exhibiting frequent anger and or rage. Yeah, that was me. Engaging in cognitive dissonance. Well, let me say a little bit about what that actually means. It's that it's that feeling of discomfort you get when you have two modes of thoughts or images of yourself that are in conflict, like your ideas or your beliefs or what you think of yourself, your interior narrative of who I am, or your behavior is opposite of what, you hear people say all the time, well, I never do this, but, and then they talk about what they just did. Um, this can also occur, like in my case, where there's a clash between different aspects of the, or different parts of the self or selves, multiple selves. Like we have self representations, and sometimes they're mutually contradictory. Like we might present at one time as the bad boy, but then at another time as the hero, for instance. Well, those are mutually contradictory and they create some discomfort. So that's cognitive dissonance. Judging others for not overcoming their feelings or difficulties. How often have you ever heard someone in a 12-step meeting say, well, you need to just be in the solution, stay in the solution, don't get so much into the problem. Well, if you don't know what the problem is, it's really hard to find a solution. And sometimes I've found that when I'm reacting to what someone else is sharing about their feelings and I'm judging it, it's probably something that I'm trying to deny in myself and not deal with. And one of the things I've learned to do is try and own that. So pretending that everything is okay when it's not, you know, uh, presenting a false self or presenting oneself as having all the answers, or also none of the answers. I've done that too. I don't know anything. I don't know about that. I don't know. That's not true. We know a lot, and so that's kind of what some of the signs of spiritual bypassing are. Um, well, the difficulty in my case was that the cause of the beliefs, behaviors, and emotions generated by that bypassing lay largely beneath the level of my conscious thought or my ability to access it intellectually. That the problem was caused by the way that I defined the problem. And my spiritual solutions only reinforced that underlying problem. The underlying assumptions seemed to be a fundamental part of myself. They were axiomatic in my way of seeing myself and the world around me. That is, axioms are those bottom line uh, mathematical equations and assumptions that underlie all of math. Well, in in my case, there were some assumptions about me that underlay that whole um, way of looking at me and the world. So I've been placing a great dependence on the various paths, like God, meditation, the 12 steps, myself, and spirituality. I placed a lot of dependence on those to solve a problem that wasn't the real problem. I mean, sometimes when I hear people say, just turn it over, what I hear is deny, deny, deny. Just ignore it, it'll go away. Um, that has never really worked for me. In fact, my sponsors told me that you don't turn it over in the third step, you turn it over after the seventh or eighth or ninth step. That the third step is really about making a decision. So the real problem was that my delusion led me to believe that I was the problem that needed to be solved. The answers were all out there. I mean, so if I am the problem, rather than say alcoholism is the problem, then I have to find something that'll fix me. And obviously, it has to be something out there. It can't be something from within me. So there's a difference, by the way, between denial and delusion. My walk may be a great example of it. I couldn't see the delusion. Okay. Um, in my definition of the word, delusion corresponds with the very image one has of oneself. It underlies all the perceptions that seem inherent in one's observed reality, and seemingly it's an intrinsic part of who I am. Uh, you know, whereas denial, it's usually a function of willful refusal to acknowledge a fact that you already know is true. Um, but you just deny it. From this perspective, as nouns, the difference between denial and delusion might be that denial is like the negation in logic, while delusion is a false belief that is just resistant to confrontation with actual facts or reality. Um, so, I I began studying Buddhism around my seventh year of sobriety in an effort to overcome myself, to enter the stream of enlightenment, and fix myself. Essentially, I just used the same approach to Buddhism and meditative techniques as I had with Christianity and with the 12-step programs. So the underlying axiomatic assumption was that I'm not enough. I'm a defective character. I gotta uh, I gotta find a way uh, to fix me, to eradicate the self that I am, to annihilate that self so that then I can build some other self and be okay. Well, good luck. So here's something Zach Kornfeld said, who is a Buddhist teacher and psychoanalyst that I really like. Many have come to a spiritual practice with this problem, what some psychologists call a weak sense of self, or a needy ego with holes in their psyche and heart. This deficient sense of self is carried for years by our habits and bodily contractions, by the stories and mental images we have learned to tell ourselves. If we have a deficient sense of self, if we perennially negate ourselves, then we may easily confuse our inner poverty with selflessness and believe it to be sanctioned as the road to enlightenment. You know, I hear people talk about needing to um, smash the ego, and uh, I personally believe the problem is more about having holes in the psyche and in the heart than it is anything to do with smashing an ego. I really don't agree with that idea. It's not in the big book, by the way. It says smashing delusion, the delusion that we may be like other people. Um, so uh, that deficiency, that negation of ourselves, is part of what can be lead into this spiritual bypassing. So, what about meditation? Everybody talks about how wonderful meditation is. You got to learn to meditate, be a meditator. Well, um, Kevin Griffin wrote a wonderful book called One Breath at a Time, Buddhism and the 12 Steps, which really kind of tells his story about how he integrated the 12 steps in his life as a Buddhist teacher and meditator. And here's a couple of things he said. Although meditation can be difficult at first, after some practice it becomes pleasant. It can even become another kind of high. Buddhist texts warn the meditator away from getting attached to the pleasure of meditation. The very structure of the meditative experience can help us to stay in denial about our dysfunction. We can use meditation as a place to hide. So I did that. I did that a lot. I've been a meditator for decades, and it took me a long time to learn the difference between meditating for the jhanas or for the high, and meditating to just be in the moment, to allow myself to be in my body, to be able to be with whatever is going on. So let's talk about this idea of transcending. I hear that a lot. I'm going to transcend my humanness, or transcend these problems. Or I was 11 years in recovery from alcohol and drug addiction, sitting in a treatment center in the desert outside of Tucson, Arizona, and diagnosed with chronic depression. When I got the aha insight that human was probably about as spiritual as I would ever get, and that that was perfectly fine. Believe it or not, my depression began to lift, and I could actually smell flowers and see beauty. As I told in my story, I had a real problem. But for me, depression wasn't black, it was gray. Um, Now, there was a long road of recovery following that, and it continues to this day. But um, so here's what Ingrid Clayton said. This was in Psychology Today, if I remember correctly. If you have found a way to transcend the human condition, my hat is off to you, truly. But for the rest of you who continue to wrestle with emotional growing pains, I'm spreading the news about spiritual bypass as a reminder that we are not supposed to rise above it all. Easy for her to say. We can't outrun our own feet. We can't outthink our own brains. We can't override this human operating system that we live and breathe in every hour of every day, freeing ourselves of pain and problems. Not perpetually, anyway. I didn't know that. I thought the whole point was to rise above, that the whole point was to, as I've said before, to go placidly amid the noise and haste with long flowing robes, untouched by anything like a real human emotion or experience, and conflict free. Um, so, is this about happiness or bad news? Well, ultimately, happiness comes down to choosing between the discomfort of becoming aware of your mental afflictions and the discomfort of being ruled by them. I really believe that that's one of the, the most important aspects of working any uh, process like the 12 steps or therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy. There are any number of therapies that part of the essence of them is to understand and become aware of the mental afflictions that are ruling us, such that we can uh, manage them and perhaps overcome them. So, just seeing the delusion, though, recognizing that underlying psychological, mental, or behavioral results of the delusion, that didn't result in anything like happiness or even permanent relief for me. It did begin an earnest effort to recognize the symptoms and seek solutions in my life. And we talked about some of those solutions in part 2 of the webinar last August, or depending on when you're hearing this, in August of 2020. So for me, the solution was about taking the pain. Um, you know, if you're a big booker, you know that talks about if we are painstaking about this phase of our development. It may be important to recognize that sometimes the pain doesn't just magically go away. And sometimes, as with deep meditation practice, the pain actually seems to intensify. So, in my case, the fact was that the pain didn't necessarily mean that I was doing something wrong. It actually meant I was doing something right. In fact, I had a sponsor who used to say that to me. Just because you're feeling this doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It may mean you're doing something right. The pain of doing a fourth step or a fifth step is very often about doing something right. So now what? Well, we used to call this stage 2 recovery emotional sobriety. It's an ongoing journey, and consciousness or awareness is required. Now, we covered a lot of that in part 2 of our webinar on emotional sobriety. That is available on the Freethinkers Living Sober website. Um, Here's something else John Wellwood said that I think is really, really wonderful. Enlightenment is not some ideal goal, perfect state of mind, or spiritual realm on high, but a journey that takes place on this earth. It is the process of waking up to all of what we are and making a complete relationship with that. I just love that. And if you've read any of Stephen Batchelor's work, who is a secular Buddhist and a wonderful author, um, he talks about how we kind of misunderstand uh, what he believes the Buddha was talking about when he talked about our nirvana or enlightenment. That actually, for me anyway, a better way of looking at it is non-reactive. You know how learning how to not just react to whatever's going on outside of us or inside of us, that's a process. That's a and it's a real freedom to learn that and to do that to the extent that we can. So I thought that was just a brilliant quote. If you ever get a chance to read that book, it's especially if you happen to be Buddhist or have a Buddhist orientation, it's a wonderful book. Um, so I that's about it for me. Um, I don't want to keep going on and on. So if you want more on the path of emotional sobriety, you can visit our recording of the webinar at es.freethinkerslivingsober.org. Just click on the menu item for resources, and we also have links to the websites for Dr. Alan Berger, for Joe C., for Maria Hornbacher, and stay tuned because we may have updates and information about future events or articles, a variety of things on that particular website. Our normal website, our regular website is just freethinkerslivingsober.org, but this is a special website just concerned with emotional sobriety. Thank you for listening. I appreciate you being here, and I hope that this helped in some way.